Hello, everyone, and welcome to One Young World 2022 Delegates to this section on people, planet, prosperity, fighting poverty in developing countries. My name is Edmilson Angelo. I am a One Young World ambassador. I am also the founder and director of Change One's Life, which is a global charity assisting people in need around sub-Saharan Africa by developing practicable, applicable, and sustainable solutions to combat poverty. And I will be moderating this amazing section with this amazing panel. I actually decided to give each panelist a minute just to introduce yourself. If you can perhaps start with Benu Bidani, please. If you can have a minute just to tell us who you are and what you do.
Hi, and thanks for having me on the panel. I'm Danny Harvey. I'm Executive Director of Concern Worldwide in the UK. So Concern is an international humanitarian organisation doing emergency response and working with people in extreme poverty in 24 of the world's most fragile and conflict-affected countries.
Thank you very much, Danny. We can move on then to Benu Bidani. Please, if you can introduce yourself.
Great, thank you so much. I'm Benu Bidani. I work at the World Bank and I'm the practice manager for the Poverty and Equity Global Practice. I've spent the last over 25 years working at the World Bank, primarily on, poverty, inequality, labor markets, and I'm delighted to be here today.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, we are honored to have Dr. Charles Owubah. Please, Dr. Charles, you can introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Charles Owubah, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Action Against Hunger US. Action Against Hunger is the leading global advocate, and what we do the most is to be able to have a global movement to end hunger for everyone for good. And we operate in almost 50 countries around the world.
Thank you very much for that, Charles. This is amazing. It really is an honor to be moderating this panel. And I hope that we are able to build on a very good conversation for all the delegates watching. And I wanted to start our conversation with something around the topic of poverty, as it is estimated that around 9% of the global population lives in extreme poverty, with this global rate rising for the first time over the 20 years, over the last 20 years, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. My question to the panelists, just to begin with our conversation, is what key actions would you say needs to be taken by governments, charities, and local communities to address the root causes of extreme poverty? And if I can please start with Danny Harvey, please. What are your thoughts on that? What can we do?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, at this point in time, the key action is to be really determined. So this year, I think we're seeing impact of conflict in Ukraine on global food prices and what that means for extreme poverty and global hunger. So we need to keep our eyes on the SDGs and the target to halve poverty, eliminate hunger in all its forms by 2030. They sound very ambitious. And I think from my perspective and from Concern's perspective, the key is to remain focused on leave no one behind. So it's about putting efforts where where the extreme poorest people are, or people living in extreme poverty are. So we know by 2030, about 2/3 of people living in extreme poverty will be in fragile conflict-affected states. So that's where we should be putting efforts. And the effort should be really around building that resilience, so resilience at household, community, systems levels, to help people withstand shocks and to put in place those kind of anticipatory interventions like social protection that can kick in very quickly so that you protect livelihoods, you kind of preempt risks, and you sort of manage that so that people can thrive. And every time a shock, whether it's a flood or the impact of a conflict, that people are more resilient and better protected.
Following from Danny, I sort of agree with much of what she said. And, what you said is very true. This slowdown in poverty reduction this is a reversal without precedent. Since we've been keeping our records on poverty reduction, this is the largest, the COVID 19 crisis really led to a global economic crisis, which, increased poverty for the first time in 2020, as you mentioned. And the pandemic's effects were really compounded and are being compounded by, the impacts of climate change and COVID and climate change and conflict, right? So millions of people are being pushed into poverty. And the poor, whenever there are shocks, tend to suffer the most. So at a very high level, a sustainable solution for poverty reduction and long-term development includes, inclusive growth, right? You want to create jobs and opportunities for people, human capital, tackling climate change, building institutions, and promoting peace, because we know all of these are critical ingredients. But what I think the COVID shock has probably brought to the forefront also is really how households need the ability to manage risks and prevent these risks, right? As Danny was also saying, whether it's through social protection programs, social insurance. So that also is a very important part of the poverty reduction sort of strategy. So not only is it important to have sound policies, you also need effective and adaptive implementation. I think if there's one thing we've learned is that the challenges that are coming, are novel, they're unprecedented, they're interacting with each other. And so we need to learn lessons quickly and adapt, and you need good data to be able to, for example, make good policy choices. Okay. And that, I think, the learning from that will also allow us to be better prepared for the next crisis. I want to end on an optimistic note to say that, insurmountable setbacks have been reversed. So I think what you need is urgent action, collective action, collaboration, and adequate resources to be able to help this happen.
Yes, I would like to add to what my colleagues have already indicated. Right. First, we need to care more about people, whether they are neighbors or in countries that we may never visit. Why do I say that? Because we live in one global ecosystem. And in an ecosystem, whatever happens to any unit within the ecosystem affects everything within that ecosystem. So you take the case of Ukraine, where we are today, with the war, with the terrible things happening. What it has caused the food crisis today that we're dealing with. Yes, the war is taking place in Ukraine, but people are suffering in Somalia. The second point has to do with the fact that we need to be much more serious about addressing the root causes of hunger than what we are doing today. Why do I say that? Because a disproportionately large number of vulnerable and hungry people depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. With climate change, the rainfall patterns have become very erratic. They are not reliable. So why can't the smallholder farmer, who produces more than 80% of the food in most of the countries we work in, be given access to irrigation? Because the analysis are very clear. Water is key when it comes to agricultural production. Without water, plants will not grow. So why is it that we are not able to help the smallholder farmer? I'll give you an example. See, for less than $200, a small pump can be used to irrigate 2 acres of land. Why haven't we done this on a large scale everywhere? So for my organization, based on analysis, we need to be able to do more, and that's where we are going. But I also like to add this as a third point. If we need to be able to address extreme poverty, guess where our attention needs to be? Needing to pay attention to maternal and child health. For example, a child that is fed well from 0 to 5, we know that the child is going to be set for life. Because when he or she goes to school, he or she is going to gain the cognitive skills necessary for him or her to be able to live. Without that, the child is doomed for life. If we want to break that poverty cycle, the mother who is pregnant, fed well, and before the child comes up to 0 to 5, if we did that, That would be a big dent in terms of dealing with poverty. So I want us to be much more serious about addressing these root causes than we've done in the past.
We know that developing countries are suffering the most from the negative impact of climate change, which is then furthermore increasing the gap in terms of economic divide between nations. My question for the panelists here is, what key initiatives should policymakers take in order to increase the adaptive capacity of effective communities and tackle the climate crisis in the developing policies?
No country today is immune from the impacts of climate change, right? And climate action is not necessarily easy, but every country needs to act on it. You know, according to our research, we've also shown that climate change could drive over 200 million people to migrate within their own countries by 2050, right? For developing countries going forward, you know, they need support to sort of to have a trajectory of development that isn't so carbon intensive, right? To have a greener path, and therefore they need a lot of support to make investments, for example, in clean energy at a very large scale. So they can really avoid locking into, you know, polluting infrastructure while achieving their energy access goals. Okay? And I just wanted to end that this is a very big priority for the World Bank, and we are among the largest financiers of climate action in developing countries. In 2021 alone, there was 26 billion, and I think this number is going to keep, you know, it's an important area of investment for the World Bank.
First of all, the climate crisis is a hunger crisis. I mean, to see that 811 million people go to bed hungry every day, it's just not right. And we know that with the climate crisis, that number is going to increase. So in terms of the adaptive capacity, what we need to be able to adapt, there are two key things that we need to be able to do. We need to be able to adapt to the extreme dry and hot conditions, and we need to be able to adapt to the extreme wet conditions, which is likely to lead to floods. So when it comes to the dry aspect of the climate crisis, the work that we know we need to be able to do is to be able to accelerate research into drought-resistant crops. We also need to grow and improve the yields of indigenous crops that have had hundreds of years in terms of adapting to the extreme environment. I'll give you an example. Maize is a pampered crop. Why do I say that? Maize requires a lot of rain. It takes a lot of nitrogen. But where are we growing maize today? We're growing them in areas where traditionally are dry. So are we surprised that maize is not doing well in those areas? When in fact, we can grow sorghum. When in fact, we can grow millet in those places. So if we're talking about adapting to what is coming, it's going back to nature and look at how nature has actually protected us before where we are today. So that's key when it comes to dry aspects of this adaptation. We also need to adapt to the extreme wet conditions. In Pakistan, for example, some work that we're doing there, because of flooding and the sea actually moving to low lands, they cannot grow anything. So we're working with farmers to be able to grow hardier and saline tolerant crops, such as sugar beets, so that these individuals living in those areas can survive and in some cases even able to thrive. One thing we also need to do is to be able to improve our weather forecasting capabilities. I mean, this is the 21st century with the satellites everywhere. We should be able to predict what is going to happen this year. And by the time we finish that year, be able to look into the future to see what else is coming. So we're talking of situations where if our predictive capacity is so good, we can tell that this year we're probably going to grow a lot more of the drought-resistant crops because we know it's going to be dry. And perhaps the following year, based on the prediction, we're going to be growing a lot of these, crops that can withstand a lot of the water. We also need to protect springs and streams and rivers because we know that with the dry conditions, these springs are going to, evaporate, the streams and others, and it doesn't take a lot. Buffer zones, simple buffer zones around these streams and rivers can go a long, long way to be able to help. There must be a new thinking when it comes to planning our cities. Instead of the concrete pavement that we see all over, we're probably going to get a situation where we need to have open spaces where we allow the rain to be able to soak, to percolate into the soil to recharge the aquifers. We need to think differently around this time. Let me give you another example, and I'll stop there. With climate change, with the extremes of the weather that we are seeing, with rainfall happening everywhere, we need to be smart enough to start storing the runoffs. I've just come from a trip to a country, I wouldn't mention the name. Vast lands, fertile soils, and everything. The only thing they don't have is water to be able to irrigate their crops. Yet we have water running off on those lands. Why can we not store these runoffs and use them in times that we need? So it's about us bringing a lot of urgency to the issue. It is here with us. And I think if we're able to do so, you should be able to help us.
Yeah, and I totally agree with what my fellow panelists have said, and I'm going to just pick up two additional ideas. The first is around financing. So, there needs to be sufficient resource to tackle climate change. It needs to move from the wealthy countries to those countries which are most affected. We have lobbied with others in the Climate Action Network to try and ensure that 50% of the financing goes to adaptation. All the things, Charles, that you're talking about, so that's properly funded. And moreover, the funding actually materializes. So, it moves from a commitment to actual resources that flow. 100 billion that's been promised by 2023 flows to the countries where it is needed most. And that we as NGOs, we can have a responsibility then to monitor that and to work on some of those technical solutions that will help make that funding more effective. And I guess the second part then is how that happens, and that's to put the people affected by climate change at the heart of it. So at the heart of the decision making, the heart of the discussions, the heart of deciding where things go and how they're spent, and then at the heart of the local adaptation and recognizing that the knowledge to make those adaptations, whether it's climate smart agriculture or how you manage your livestock when you have a lot of flooding or drought, those lie with people, representative organizations at local levels. So I guess my points kind of complement the sort of technical solutions and think a little bit about the how these things should happen too.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. If we can now just move to more specific questions regarding what you guys do. And actually, continue with you, Danny. Concern Worldwide implements a range of programs to tackle the poverty cycle and help rebuild livelihoods. My question to you is, what key challenges are you witnessing in the effort to economically empower the most vulnerable communities? And have there been any significant successes towards eradicating extreme poverty?
We have a conceptual framework in Concern Worldwide to try, when we work with the community, to try and understand really what the underlying causes of the situation of extreme poverty they find themselves in. So we look at the lack of assets. So you don't have land, you don't have productive land, you don't have resource, you might not have a livelihood. But two things kind of push that down. One, I think we've talked about quite a lot, which is risk. So you might live in a marginal area, you may not have good social networks or a lot of assets, so that when a drought comes or a flood comes, you're immediately impacted by that shock. The other is inequality, and particularly I think gender inequality, but inequality related to ability, socioeconomic status. These things, no matter how much you invest in an economic activity, prevent people rising up. A couple of things that we think are really successful is an approach called graduation, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, where you couple a sort of reliable cash transfer with a mentor and a coach and business training and an asset transfer. And these multiple inputs help people who are often really marginalized, they're living in extreme poverty, to actually for multiple livelihood opportunities that are much more resilient and help them move out of poverty. The other thing which we do in all of our programming is look at gender inequality. So whether we're working on agriculture, whether we're working on WASH, whether it's a humanitarian response, the tackling gender inequality and working with men and women, boys and girls to create the environment for women to actually fully own and use resources, have voice at community level, and be active in the development of their families and communities and countries. That's absolutely critical, because without looking at the gender equality, the livelihood opportunities become limited, because you're limiting what people or what women can do.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I actually have got a question for Dr. Charles Owubah as well. In 2020, 2.37 billion people lacked sufficient access to safe and nutritious food, with 1 in 9 people globally being hungry or undernourished. How has Action Against Hunger supported communities to fight hunger and access life-saving treatment? And what more can be done by world governments to make sure that healthy diet is attainable by all?
So the DNA of Action Against Hunger is based on science and innovation, right? Because as a global leader fighting hunger and with others, we believe that with science we can have a lot more impact, right, than anything else. So we first go in there, and it's about looking at the innovation, what we can do to be able to help people. So I'll give an example. We're among a team of individuals and groups that actually developed the therapeutic food, which we use today worldwide to be able to treat, severely malnourished children, right? So that's the DNA part of the work that we do. So with that, when we go to a place, most of the time we go to places where children are severely malnourished. So the plan then is to make sure we save their lives. And by using this therapeutic food, we are able to save life. The child who is close to dying is able to come out stronger and better and has life within a matter of weeks. So that's what we do. But after we finish that, we stay in the community, because we know what led the child to become severely malnourished. We also have the solutions as well. So we stay in the community, and as some of my colleagues have already indicated, one of the things we do well is to strengthen the resilience of the community members so that they can withstand the shocks that we know will certainly come. Part of your question talks about what would governments do. They play a critical role in the health of a nation. So we need to be able to constantly work with governments. One thing that I want to share with you all is that we need more investment in hunger programs, because $1 invested in a hunger program returns $16 into the economy. $1 invested in a hunger program yields $16. So it's a smart investment. And so if we're able to do that more, we need to be able to then reach a lot more people. Hunger is also about power relations. And we know that working with government can pass laws and policies to be able to eliminate and reduce the harmful effects of these relations, to be able to address injustices within society.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I also have got a question for Benu Bidani. One of the World Bank's main goal is to ensure that all citizens are able to participate in and benefit from national economic gains. How can we make sure that economic growth is distributed fairly across all societies and create equal opportunities for all?
If anything, the COVID-19 crisis has also really brought equity to the front. Inequality, not only has poverty increased, but inequality has also increased globally, both across countries, within countries. So for example, within countries, those who were hit harder initially, such as women, low-skilled workers, those who worked in the urban informal sector, they also really recovered more slowly. And even children, if you look at children, 50% of children in low-income countries stopped learning in the initial phase of the crisis. And it was only about 5% in our upper middle income countries, right? So at the end of the day, to promote an equitable recovery, you need strong and inclusive growth, correct? And job creation. We know from our research that labor incomes are the main driver of reduction in poverty. Yeah. And the poor tend to work in agriculture, in the service sector. So really where that growth is coming from also matters, right? So actually increasing the productivity of agriculture and areas where the poor are working is very important. If you looked at the COVID crisis, what really mattered was access to digital technologies, right? The internet allowed you to access schooling, work from home. So, making markets also work for the poor, such as digital markets, financial inclusion, having competition. All of these things are really important for job creation and really creating productive jobs for people.
What advice would you give to the One Young World delegates watching this section, working to alleviate extreme poverty and ensure that no one is left behind? And I want to start with Danny Harvey, please.
Thank you. So I have 3 thoughts to share. I mean, the first one is stay informed. We live in a world where, the connectivity that we have through digital enables us to see the world through other people's experiences and eyes. So I think that idea of being in touch with people, including people experiencing extreme poverty across the world, and the opportunity of then global movements is really important. The second one, government allocation of resources is really important. Hold your governments to account. Every petition you send, every time you speak up, every time you scrutinize where money is spent and the government's holding their commitments, whether it's on policy around nutrition, policy around climate change, or overseas development assistance, is really important, because that is how governments are held accountable, and it influences how things change and develop. But finally, I would say, be the change. We all have a carbon footprint. You can reduce it. Whether you cut down eating meat, whether you change the way you travel, that has an impact. And we all live with inequalities in the social groups and societies that we live in, whether it's around gender, around race, around ability. Be aware of the inequalities and make an effort to challenge them and to change them if you can.
I would say really engage. Don't be a bystander. I think wherever you live, even in the most well-to-do countries, I live in Washington, D.C., there are inequities and people who are not, you see tents where the homeless are living versus big palatial mansions. So really, being a part, sort of engaging through the political process, through what you do, and small things add up to big, big things.
Yeah, I have 3 points as well. First, you need to be outraged that global hunger continues today. The failure of humankind to feed its own anywhere in the world is unacceptable. When there is abundant wealth and tools to be able to feed people, it's unacceptable. In fact, if we can talk about space tourism and make it real where we are today in the 21st century, we can end hunger for everyone for good. Here's my second point. We need a higher sense of urgency to address global hunger. People are dying from hunger when in fact we can't save them. My third point is this. You need to be hopeful. You need to be hopeful that it is possible to create a world where no child dies from hunger. I say so because I believe in you. And I'm counting on you to help us create this movement so that we can end hunger. It is the basic thing to life. Food. It is so basic. If you go into the wild, if you go to the wild, look at what animals behave. Food is basic. Why are we here today? 811 million people going hungry. And we know that by 2030, we're not going to reach zero hunger. We should all be concerned. But I believe in you. I trust you. Please, as my colleagues have indicated, don't be a bystander. Get engaged. And we look forward to engaging you all. Thank you very much.
Oh, amazing, amazing, amazing. Very inspiring indeed. I'm 100% sure that all the delegates watching these sections will definitely feel motivated and inspired to be more, to do more, and to stand up for something bigger than themselves. And that concludes the section on fighting poverty. Thank you so much for that information and for the important discussion that we just had. And thank you all for joining. And on behalf of One Young World, we are so happy to have you as part of this community. Thank you and goodbye.